And to you, a very good morning now to the Dubbo Region Mayor, Matt Dickerson. How are you, Matt?
Yeah, good, thanks, Brett. Good to be talking to you.
And to you, sporting a brand new lawn mowed haircut, I can see. That's good. Do you think I need one?
No, I think your hair looks just fine for radio, Brett.
Yeah, the hair on the face, though, maybe needs some trimming. Mate, you had a council meeting last night. There's a few things we wanted to get to, including the fact that Dubbo Regional councillors were deciding whether to ask the Wellington North and Suntop Solar Farm operators to enter agreements to provide community benefits. That notice of motion, put forward by Councillor Richard Ivey, proposes each operator be contacted to enter into a voluntary planning agreement in line with Council's adopted Renewable Energy Benefit Framework. How did the vote go down last night?
Yeah, pretty obvious one there. That was voted for in favour of us doing that. And we don't hold out great hope for this actually being successful, but we think it's worthwhile going down the path. It doesn't cost much to ask the question, it costs much to send a letter to these proponents. The problem is that these were put in place before really there was any guideline, any policy in place. And so it seems like it's a bit unfair that new proponents that are coming along with a wind or solar, we've got our guidelines in place now, 1.5% of the capital investment value. We ask for a voluntary planning agreement around that amount over the life of the project. But these proponents, for example, haven't got any contribution they're making to the broader community. Sure, they're still making contribution in terms of employment, in terms of money they might produce, but we think it would be nice for them to do that. Now, whether they'll do that or not, that'll just come down to their social conscience. There is no requirement for them to do it. And one of our great frustrations, Brett, is that all these projects, there's no legislation or requirement where they have to pay money to the local community. Some of the proponents are very good to deal with. Some of them are actually quite good in terms of entering voluntary planning agreements and contributing money to the local economy, the local community. Some of them say, I don't need to do that, so I won't worry about doing that. We're hoping that these ones feel the pressure of other proponents that are doing it and maybe come to the party.
Because other organisations or businesses, large ones, inclusive of the fracking, that was the same or similar, that they're not giving back to the community. I know this is a separate situation here with wind farms, but it really is a matter of putting it back into the place where you take it from, or where you're going to build your wind farm as a company. I'd imagine that would be important to make sure that the community is on side and that we're doing the right thing. Because, council is looking towards net zero too, aren't you?
Well, we are certainly, but these issues we're talking about here, we're going to be providing power for about 42% of the state's power needs out of our renewable energy zone. Now, the actual farmers, the landowners, will receive good compensation for projects being on their land. But it's the community that we think, if this community is providing 42% of the power for the state, it seems fair and reasonable that the community has some sort of compensation, some sort of advantage out of being the power provider for the rest of the state. And that's where these voluntary planning agreements, and it frustrates me no end that it's voluntary planning agreements, that's where they come into effect, where we want to be able to achieve additional things for the community. And that's the idea of the planning agreements, is that there are some additional things that the community can achieve out of having some funds come into the community. And a whole range of things can be achieved out of that money. There are things that aren't related specifically to the project. So, for example, if a road needs to be upgraded for the various components of that project, that is not part of the voluntary planning agreement. That has to be done as part of the project. Okay. So that is part of the planning for, these are all state government projects. But we just think extra things for the community, and it seems fair and reasonable, but it's a negotiation with each individual one, and that's the frustrating part.
Has council contacted state government on changing that, or know the reason why this is voluntary?
We've certainly had discussions. I've had discussions with Penny Sharp, the State Minister. I've had discussions with Chris Bowen, the Federal Minister, and I'm not Robinson Crusoe. Most people, most councils that have got renewable energy projects around the area are very frustrated. And in fact, I was on a video conference recently which had mayors from across the nation, and the common frustration, there were different points we had to make around a whole range of things, but the common frustration we all had was we want to have some consistency in planning agreements, and they have to be compulsory. See, we're not the consent authority. Council doesn't get to say yes or no to these projects, but we're asking along the way, can we put our hand out and can you give us some money please for our community? Meanwhile, the consent authority is the state government. So they get to say yes or no, but we've got to try and negotiate. And if there's no consequence for them to say no to us, then they don't have to say yes to us. So
Matt-
that's part of the problem.
Matt, it sounds like they've not been able to give you a clear answer on why these are voluntary. Is that what you're saying?
There's certainly been no clear answer from state government through that planning process as to say why it's not compulsory for them to pay money. And so again, we've been asking the federal government and asking the state government to put consistency across the board to say every time these projects happen, we've got a guideline now that's 1.5%. That'd be a reasonable one, but it doesn't have to be that. Just something where it doesn't rely on us as a council. We're going to be having 37 different negotiations with 37 different proponents in our area. Each one of them might involve 3 or 4 meetings, and all of them you're just holding your hand out and saying, please, if it's okay. And that's not a great way to go to a negotiation.
Sounds like a bit of a wasted time for council, even though we'll benefit in the end with those companies building out here. But that would be slowing council down a bit, wouldn't it?
Well, it's not a waste of time, but it certainly is consuming time.
Yeah.
Because we are getting benefits, we are getting companies that do sign up, so it's not a complete waste of time, but there's certainly a much more efficient way to go. And if there was a standard guideline that was part of the planning process and the proponents knew, oh, well, I know in all of my costs I've got to have 1.5% for the local community, that's it, done, we'll just go and sign the agreement up, that would make it much easier rather than this ongoing negotiation with each individual proponent.
All right, we've got to move on to other things. We were recently contacted by a listener who wanted to know the reason why council is proposing to lift waste collection charges by 16% in the budget.
It really is just about financial sustainability, Brett. One of the great challenges that we have with council is to make sure that all of our different units of council are profitable or as close to being in the black as possible. Some of them we're never going to be able to generate income from, but we've got rate pegging for our general rates. We don't have rate pegging for our various charges for our different facilities of council, so we come up with figures that we think are reasonable to do cost recovery and make sure we're in the black for those. What I'd encourage any listeners to do is to put a submission in and tell us reasons that they don't want those charges. Obviously no one likes to see fees go up, but again we need to make sure we've got a sustainable council next year, next decade, next century. We want to make sure this council is still sustainable into the future.
If I didn't touch on this with you, it might have been your CEO, Murray Wood. Going into factoring in this decision, you've thought about the cost of living pressures on ratepayers, have you not, before putting these up or looking at putting these up?
Yeah, it's certainly something that weighs heavily on our minds, that there is a lot of pressure on people in terms of their cost of living. At the same time, we want to make sure we're living in a modern, progressive council, and we want to make sure we've got a bottom line in the black. There's no point having a bottom line in the red year after year. You eventually drain your resources and then you'd have to have a large correction. We want to make sure that each year, as much as possible, we're in the black by a little bit.
I guess because last night you were looking at your councillor pay and the mayoral pay. Let's talk about that, but can you see how people would interpret that going up, and now there's a motion to put up this increase in pay, and people sort of blend the lines there and they think, well, is that going to pay for that? This is not what this is it?
No, definitely not. And they are specifically separate buckets, so that, for example, money that we charge for our water, that must stay in that particular bucket. Our waste charges in a separate different bucket. The councillor fees, I'm happy to talk about councillor charges or councillor wages. It's one of the things that is no end of frustration, and we actually put a submission in about this. IPART make recommendations about how much councillors should be paid across all councils across the state, 128 councils, and it's a councillor fee and a mayoral fee. They make recommendations and then they send them back to councils for councils to vote on their own wages, which I think seems a bit wrong. And as one councillor said last night, we have declarations of conflicts of interest for a whole range of minor things. If ever there was a conflict of interest, it's when we vote for our own wages. Imagine an employer going to their boss and say, right, we'll just all sit around and vote for our own wages. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So we're asked to do that for a start, which is never a good look in the community and makes councillors generally feel pretty uncomfortable. The wage increase last night, we voted to put it up by 3.5%, so not exorbitant, but the wage for a councillor is $27,050. Most people don't realise just how small an amount a councillor is paid. No councillor that I've ever met does it for the money, they do it for the love of the community, the passion. We've got an overall community asset here worth $3 billion. The budget for next year is approximately $180 million. A lot of responsibility on councillors managing All of this on behalf of 56,720 people. To be paid $27,050 is not a lot. And for the mayoral fee, happy to talk about that as well, the increase we voted last night was to go up to $66,800. Again, for the mayor as the one that's full-time responsible for that in addition to councillors, not a lot of money. So I don't think most councillors, again, we feel uncomfortable about voting for our wages, but I don't think most people would argue that we're overpaid as councillors. I think certainly underpaid is the term more often heard.
Do you think this has come at the wrong time, especially with the cost of living crisis, that you have to do this? And, you know, IPART has gone to councils to ask you to do it. I mean, there's probably never a good time, but right now is not really a good time, is it?
It happens every year at this time. It's the same time that IPART go through. They look at the wages for different style councils, different size councils. They put their recommendations forward, and we've put in our submission, as many councils did across the state. Don't bring it back to council, just make a determination and say, this is how much you'll pay councillors in each of these councils across the state. That seems like the smart, sensible thing to do, because no council likes to vote to put their wages up. But at the same time, we want to encourage people to stand for council. We've got an election coming up later this year. $27,050 is really not fair compensation. If you're doing your job properly as a councillor, you're putting in a lot of hours every week. It's really not fair compensation for that, for the responsibility you have.
I think the angst for people listening in Dubbo would be that they're probably thinking not all councillors are doing the right thing. That's probably an unfair thing to say without, you know, having any proof of the matter. But do you feel that's where, you know, because people are going to be thinking, well, they've all voted to freeze this because we're in a cost of living crisis. We can't continue to pay increased rates, etc., etc., etc.
Well, it's all about CPI, it's all about cost of living, and 3.5%. The CPI is higher than that. So in real terms, councillor wages have actually gone down. But again, I stress that amount, Brett, $27,050 as a councillor in charge of an organisation worth $3 billion on behalf of the community. If you're doing your job as a councillor, you're reading a lot of information every week, but you're still making decisions on behalf of that entire community. So I don't have any problem at all with councillors being paid $27,000. All I do have a problem, I don't think it's enough that they're being paid, but I don't have a problem with it going up by 3.5%.
So what was the outcome?
We voted in favour of putting the wages up by 3.5%. So the new wages for a council will be $27,050, and for the mayor, $66,800.
All right, just out of time. Matt Dickinson, thanks very much. I appreciate you coming in and being open like you are.
Always my pleasure, Brett.
All right, Dubbo Region Mayor Matthew Dickinson this morning here at 2 to You.